Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today is the penultimate episode of all of the magic item changes in the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 2024. That means that the next episode will be the last one. I've been doing these kind of once a week for basically the past 5 weeks. So we're almost finished, but before we get to that, if you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing that now or at some point during this video if you like what you see. All of these magic item changes videos will be available down in a playlist in the description below. That playlist and many others are also just available on my channel page. If you want to go see the other things that I've done, you can also just check out the other videos that I've done that aren't in playlists as well if you are a new viewer to this channel. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. We were in the middle of the rings, so let's go ahead and get started with the next available ring. We're starting off with the Ring of Mind Shielding. The changes to this one is that it is now a magic action to make the ring perceptible or imperceptible from an action. And the ring also specifically becomes imperceptible, whereas previously this said invisible. This is similar to a change that we saw with the Gloves of Thievery, where those are now imperceptible rather than invisible. The main functionality of this is that this means that it can't be seen by creatures with true sight or see invisibility or other similar senses. What I also think is kind of interesting is that the word perceive isn't necessarily exclusive only to the sense of sight. It could also be potentially the sense of touch. So like if someone is like shaking your hand or holding your hand, for example, they might not also be able to feel that the ring is there if you have it imperceptible. Moving on to the Ring of Protection, this one is unchanged. For the Ring of Regeneration, this one is also unchanged. The Ring of Resistance now no longer requires attunement. It is otherwise the same. This one kind of surprises me a bit because the Armor of Resistance is uncommon and it requires attunement, and it does the exact same thing and it fills a more exclusive slot on you. I mean, there aren't really slots in Dungeons & Dragons per se, but you can only wear one armor at a time. Whereas for rings, you could presumably wear up to 10 rings on all of your fingers. And if you want to get really cheesy, then you could have like toe rings or, other body part rings. So presumably, there are 10 different rings of resistance, one for each of your fingers, that you could have resistance to all those damage types if you were somehow able to craft or buy or somehow acquire each individual ring of resistance. So it is just a little strange to me that this one doesn't require attunement, but the armor does. But again, it is what it is. The Ring of Shooting Stars, this no longer requires you to be outdoors at night to attune to it. It still requires attunement, but you just don't need to be outdoors at night to do that. It also no longer states that casting the Dancing Lights or Light spell from this item is at will or that it requires an action. If you've seen my previous magic item changes, this is a very common change to a lot of different magic items. Even though those things aren't there anymore, it is still implicit by the lack of limitations on how many times that you can cast it, that you can still cast these things at will. And even though it doesn't say that it is an action to cast these spells anymore, the spells themselves still have a certain casting time, usually requiring the magic action for most spells with some exceptions. Similarly, casting Fairy Fire from this item no longer states that it requires an action, but again, that is implicit because casting Fairy Fire is an action, and specifically the magic action. Moving on to the second half of the Ring of Shooting Stars. So there's a feature called Lightning Spheres that is the new name for the Ball Lightning feature of the old one in 2014. Now requires a magic action from an action. Lightning Spheres themselves now deal damage when they are moved within 5 feet of a creature other than you that isn't behind total cover. Previously in 2014, this required the creature to come within 5 feet of the orb, and cover just wasn't mentioned at all in the description, but now that is included here. Additionally, the Lightning Spheres now deal half damage on a successful saving throw. And then finally, the Shooting Stars feature is now a magic action from an action. For the Ring of Spell Storing, this one is unchanged. For the Ring of Spell Turning, this one now grants advantage on all saving throws against spells. Previously, this only granted advantage on saving throws against spells that target only you and weren't an area of effect. Additionally, if you succeed on that saving throw and the spell is 7th level or lower, then the spell has no effect on you, sort of like a magical evasion. In 2014, you actually needed to roll a natural 20 on the saving throw in order to ignore that effect. So this is a lot stronger than it used to be. Additionally, for these spells that you can ignore, if it was a spell that did target only you and wasn't an area of effect, you can now use your reaction to redirect the spell back to the caster. Previously, this didn't require any sort of action economy, but now it is specifically your reaction. So slight nerf there, but overall, this ring is much stronger than it was in 2014. Moving on to the Ring of Swimming, this one is unchanged. For the Ring of Telekinesis, this no longer states at will, but again, this is implied by the lack of other restrictions, and it can now target any legal target of the spell Telekinesis, whereas previously, when cast from this ring, it was only able to target objects that weren't being worn or carried, but now you basically just have Telekinesis at will while you have this item. So this item is actually pretty nuts now. Like, this one actually surprises me a bit as well. Telekinesis is no joke, and having a 5th level spell at will is just crazy. This almost feels like it should be a legendary ring. For the Ring of the Ram, it is now a magic action to activate either feature of this ring from an action. The attack roll from the ring is now a ranged spell attack, whereas previously this was just described as an attack. And if you use the feature that allows you to break an object, it now specifically needs to be a non-magical object. Previously this could be any object, magical or otherwise. I don't know if the fact that it's a ranged spell attack matters too much in 2024. You still have the fixed +7 bonus to hit per the description of the ring. There may be some class features or something like that, or subclass features that interact with ranged spell attacks, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. If you know of any, definitely let me know down in the comment. For the Ring of Three Wishes, it no longer states it is an action to cast Wish, but again, like many of the other features, this is implied by the fact that Wish is an action to cast, specifically the magic action. For the Ring of Warmth, this one is actually pretty significantly buffed, like unnecessarily so, but it's actually very cool. It now reduces all cold damage taken while wearing this ring by 2d8, whereas previously this was not part of the description at all. And this doesn't say once per turn or any other restrictions like that. This is as many times as you take cold damage in a turn, in a round, whatever it may be. So if you know you're going into like a one-shot or an adventure where cold damage is going to be prevalent and your DM gives you a choice of magic items, this might be one that you want to bring along because you'll probably get a lot of mileage out of it. In addition, it now protects you and your equipment from temperatures of 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Previously, this was listed as -50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. For the Ring of Water Walking, this now allows you to cast Water Walk, but only on yourself. Previously, this gave you the ability to stand and move across any liquid surfaces as if they were solid ground. Very similar effect, but Water Walk has its own rules. For the Ring of X-Ray Vision, this is now a magic action to activate from an action. For the Rival Coin, this is a new sort of common magic item to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. Basically, it's a coin, you flip it heads or tails. If it's heads, you can target one creature within 60 feet of you. They make a DC 13 Wisdom saving throw. On a fail, they take 2d4 psychic damage and have disadvantage on the next attack roll before the end of their next turn. On a success, they only take half damage. If it's tails, then you take 1d4 psychic damage. For the Robe of Eyes, the all-around vision no longer states that you can see in all directions. The special senses now includes True Sight, whereas previously this allowed you to see invisible creatures and objects as well as into the ethereal plane. And it also no longer includes the description that your eyes are always considered open and you're unable to avert your gaze from anything while you're wearing this robe. For the all-around vision, I think the text that said you could see in all directions was supposed to be flavor text, but you could also just take it literally, so that's probably why they changed that. I think both Dark Vision and True Sight is a little redundant because True Sight already gives you the ability to see normally in darkness, both magical and otherwise. Dark Vision does allow you to see normally in dim light, which True Sight technically doesn't allow you to do. Also, because this is now True Sight, in addition to the previous effects, you can now see through illusions and automatically succeed on saving throws against them. And you can also discern the true form of a creature who was changed by magic. So there's some buffs there by changing it to True Sight. Additionally, for the drawbacks, where it says the light spell cast on the robe, it gives you the blinded condition for 1 minute. The light spell in 2024 can no longer target objects that are being worn or carried. So this is not something that can happen to you while it is on you, essentially. So that part of it is kind of pointless now. The only real drawback is the daylight spell being cast within 5 feet of you. And the removal of not being able to avert your gaze is actually pretty good. Situational, but very good against things like basilisks that have a petrifying gaze that you have the choice of either to look at it or to look away. So overall, this item's just been buffed. For the Robe of Scintillating Colors, this is now just a magic action to activate from an action. For the Robe of Stars, this is a magic action to remove and cast the Magic Missile spell using one of the stars, whereas previously this was just an action. And it is also a magic action to enter or exit the astral plane from an action. The Robe of the Archmagi is completely unchanged. For the Robe of Useful Items, this one is now a magic action to remove one of the patches from an action. For the items themselves, the Spell Scroll patch now contains a level 1, 2, or 3 spell of the character's choice. Previously, it did not say that as part of the description. Presumably, the DM would have made that choice, but it is now the player's choice. For the Rod of Absorption, this now states that the canceled spell dissipates with no effect, and any resources used to cast it are wasted. Previously, there was no description for this. I definitely feel like this was always supposed to be the case, and that this is now just clarifying text. I don't know how people could think otherwise, but it must have been some point of confusion, maybe on their forums or something that they kept seeing, so they decided to include it. For the Rod of Alertness, it no longer states that you can cast one of the spells as an action, but each of these spells is a magic action, so it is implied that you need an action to cast them, specifically the magic action. And it's also just clearer that you can cast each of these spells, where I think originally it could have been interpreted that you can only cast one of the spells, maybe like Prolonged Rest, or maybe that it's only found with one of the spells on it. The wording on it was a little ambiguous, but it's much more clear now. Additionally, the Protective Aura is now a magic action to activate from an action. The Protective Aura also affects you and your your allies, whereas previously this was you and any creature that is friendly to you. Additionally, the protective aura also lets you sense the location of any invisible creature in the bright light, whereas previously this was any hostile invisible creature in the bright light. For the Rod of Lordly Might, this one's kind of dense, so the base form of this is considered a mace. That means that it would have the mace mastery, which is sap. That's assuming that you have the appropriate mastery feature and you have chosen mace as the mastery for it. Button 1 used to become a flame tongue weapon. It's effectively the same as it was. They just don't call it a flame tongue anymore because the flame tongue can be any weapon now. So now this one is specifically either a long sword or a short sword, your choice when you make it. When you do that, of course, that could potentially give you the associated mastery of those weapons. So the long sword has sap and the short sword has Vex, but of course you do need the mastery features in order to do that. Button 2 is now a battle axe, so it would have the battle axe mastery of topple, again assuming that you have the mastery feature. Likewise, button 3 is the spear, so it has the spear mastery, which is sap, again assuming that you have the appropriate weapon mastery. That's basically up to 5 different weapon types in one item. Doesn't turn into any heavy weapons, but that's fine. This would make a pretty great gift for like a sword and board fighter or even a dual wielding fighter, since they can have up to 6 weapon masteries by late levels, that they could basically have the mastery of each of these weapons. Similarly, the Barbarian gets up to 4 masteries by late level, so they could basically choose the mace, the longsword or short sword, the battle axe, and the spear, and basically be able to use the mastery in each form of this weapon. For the second half of the Rod of Lordly Might, Button 5's Battering Ram now benefits from Athletics proficiency, whereas previously this was just a Strength check. The Paralyze saving throw is now Constitution from Strength, and the Terrify is now a magic action from an action. Moving on to the Rod of Resurrection, this now no longer requires attunement by a cleric, druid, or paladin. D&D Beyond doesn't have this correct. In the actual Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024, it just says it requires attunement. It does not say by a cleric, druid, or paladin. And then also, like many of the other items that we've seen, it doesn't say that it requires an action to cast the heal or resurrection spells. This is actually important in this case because that means that they now inherit their normal casting time. So for heal, that is a normal casting time of 1 action, specifically the magic action, whereas resurrection from this item would now take an hour to cast. For the Rod of Rulership, this now takes a magic action to activate from an action. For the Rod of Security, again, it is a magic action to deactivate or activate from an action. The space that it creates is now referred to just as a demiplane, whereas previously this was frequently called a paradise or maybe an extraplanar space, but now they just say the word demiplane. And they also call out that the demiplane's environment can't harm its occupants. Previously this was not part of the description, so you can't convince people to go into it and then turn it into like the inside of a volcano or something like that. For the Rod of the Pact Keeper, this is now a magic action to activate from an action. For the Rope of Climbing, it is a magic action to activate from an action with a command word. Even though they said that it doesn't require a command word anymore, it does say that you have to command the rope at multiple points during this description. So I would assume that some sort of verbal command is still necessary. It also states that the rope is immune to poison and psychic damage, whereas previously this wasn't part of the description. But again, this would have been implicit because immunity to poison and psychic damage is just the property of objects. For the Rope of Entanglement, now no longer includes the rope's weight, whereas previously this was listed as 3 pounds. It is now a magic action to activate from an action with a command word, but again, much like the Rope of Climbing before, there are still many verbal commands throughout this description. It states you can additionally release the target by letting go of your end of the rope, whereas previously that wasn't part of the description. That's kind of news to me because I wasn't aware that you were still holding onto the rope when you did the Rope of Entanglement. I assumed that it flew towards the creature and then like wrapped them up and you weren't holding onto it at all. It goes on to say that if you're still holding the rope when the target escapes, you can use your reaction to command the rope to coil back up in your hands. Previously that wasn't part of the description. If you don't do that, then it just coils up at the feet of the target. And much like the Rope of Climbing, it is also immune to poison and psychic damage, but again, that is a normal property of objects that they have immunity to those damage types unless otherwise stated. For the Rope of Mending, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Basically the same, other than the fact that it's a magic action to activate from an action. For the Ruby of the War Mage, this one is also added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is a magic action to detach the ruby from your weapon from an action. It no longer states that an anti-magic field will not cause it to fall off, but I think this would still be implicit because the description lists very specific ways that it can be removed, and an anti-magic field is not one of them, so therefore it wouldn't have that effect. For the Saddle of the Cavalier, this whole description isn't even formatted correctly in D&D Beyond, although there are only minor changes to the functionality. So the Secure Rider feature, the one that says you can't be dismounted against your will, it now states that this property is suppressed while you have the incapacitated condition. Previously, none of the features of this worked if you had the unconscious condition. The Scarab of Protection, this no longer requires you to hold the Scarab in your hand for 1 round to reveal the magic of the Scarab. The Scarab now has a total of 3 benefits instead of 2, and the additional benefit is that it now grants you a +1 to AC, whereas previously this was not part of the description at all. Moving on to the Scimitar of Speed, this one is mostly unchanged, but because it is specifically a scimitar, it now has the Nick mastery, assuming that you have the appropriate mastery feature and that you have mastery in the scimitar. What this basically does for this item is that you no longer need to pick up the dual wielder feat to unlock your bonus action attack, because you just get one from the weapon. But you still get all of your normal attacks during your attack action, including the Nick attack, in addition to having a bonus action attack through this weapon. Additionally, it allows you to make that bonus action attack adding your strength or dexterity modifier to the damage of the attack roll, whereas the dual wielder feat doesn't let you do that either. So this weapon is still as good as it ever was, but it's also just slightly better if you have the mastery for the scimitar. For the Scroll of Protection, it is now a magic action to activate or overcome it. Previously, this was just an action. The Area of Protection is now considered a 5-foot emanation. There's no real mechanical change here. They're just now using that emanation keywording. For the Scroll of Titan Summoning, this is actually new to the Dungeon Master's Guide. You can use a magic action to read the scroll, and you can cause a creature to appear in an unoccupied space in ground or water within 1 mile of you that you can see. The Titan is considered hostile to you and all other creatures, and it disappears when it drops to 0 hit points. And then there's a list of what you can summon here, including the Tarask. Technically, there was a Scroll of Tarask summoning in one of the pre-written adventures, but now this is basically included in this item as well. For the Sending Stones, these are unchanged. Likewise, the Sentinel Shield is also unchanged. The Shield of Expression, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is also unchanged. For the Shield of Missile Attraction, this one is new to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. This gives you resistance to attacks made with ranged weapons, but it is also a cursed item where if a ranged attack targets a creature within 10 feet of you, that attack targets you instead. That includes ranged attacks from allies who are attacking a hostile creature within 10 feet of you, so that'll be something that you'll need to discover. The Shield of the Cavalier, this one is also added to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. It gives you a +2 additional bonus to your armor class on top of the normal bonus of the shield. You can replace one of your attacks during the attack action. You can replace one of your attacks during your attack action with a shield bash. This deals force damage on hit and allows you to push or knock prone a creature. It also allows you to create a protective field for 1 minute with concentration and a 5-foot emanation from you, so that's pretty cool. The +1, 2, and 3 shields are all unchanged. The silvered weapons are sort of new to the Dungeon Master's Guide. They now deal an additional die of damage against shape-shifted creatures. Technically, the idea of silvered weapons has always existed, as this was a means of bypassing certain resistances, notably against like lycanthropes. Some fiends, I think, also had resistance or immunity to non-silvered weapons, but there was never really a specific weapon entry for them, and they weren't considered magical by any means. And while the new monster manual doesn't have any resistances to non-silvered weapons, there are still shape-shifting creatures, including lycanthropes, so this would still be useful against them, although it's only useful if you critically hit with the weapon. Moving on to the Slippers of Spider Climbing, this now states that the climb speed equals your speed from just your walking speed. The Smoldering Armor, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and it is unchanged. For the Sovereign Glue, applying an ounce of the glue now requires the Utilize action, whereas what kind of action it takes was not part of the description at all. For the Spell Scroll, this one is a 2-parter. This now references your spell list from where previously this said your class's spell list. It also no longer states that it is an action to read the scroll and cast the spell from it. And the description goes on to state that casting the spell from a spell scroll requires the spell's normal casting time. It now also states that using a spell scroll only ignores material components for that spell. Previously, it ignored all components. That means verbal and somatic. It also now includes that if the casting of a spell scroll is interrupted, that you don't lose the scroll, whereas previously this was not part of the description. I'm not 100% sure what the distinction of your spell list versus your class's spell list is supposed to be. I don't know if that's supposed to include multi-classing, because that technically gives you access to multiple spell lists. If we're looking at just the rules, there's nothing in the rules that states the combined spells of everything you know from feats or whatever it is that you get are considered your spell list. The only spell lists that exist in the game are class spell lists. Although my second thought is that this is supposed to be directed towards like NPCs using spell scrolls, because a lich, for example, is just a lich. They don't have class levels to have access to the wizard spell list, so maybe that's the reason for it. I'm not quite sure. I also wanted to point out that it says casting the spell by reading the scroll requires the spell's normal casting time, which would suggest to me that something like Quicken Spell from a sorcerer would not allow you to cast a spell from a spell scroll as a bonus action, because you are required to use the spell's normal casting time. Probably doesn't make a big difference, but if someone wanted to make that argument, they're probably well supported in doing so. For the second half of the spell scroll description, this one is unchanged. However, I never actually noticed the last final line at the bottom of this image around copying a scroll into a spell book. It says a wizard spell on a spell scroll can be copied into a spell book. When a spell is copied this way, the copier must succeed on an intelligence arcana check with a DC equal to 10 plus the spell's level. On a successful check, the spell is copied, and whether that succeeds or fails, the spell scroll is destroyed. So at first, again, that's my first time ever reading that. That text still existed in 2014. I just never saw that part of this description of spell scrolls. So that at first seemed to fly in the face of the rules for spell scroll transcribing in the player's handbook in the class for the wizards, where it takes 2 hours and 50 gold per spell level in order to copy a spell into your spell book. But I think both are true. This one seems to be a fast way to do it that has a risk of failure, whereas if you spend the time and the gold to do so, then there's no risk of failure. This also specifically only works for spell scrolls, and it does not work for if you find another wizard's spell book and are copying spells from their spell book. Notably, wizards now at level 2 have the ability to take expertise in one of their skills that they're proficient in, so you are very much incentivized to take Arcana. If you have Arcana, and maybe if you take like Magic Initiate Cleric for guidance or something like that, or if you're the Hobgoblin and you can get that +1 to 3 from having allies around you if you fail a check, you can basically make it so that you can't ever fail getting a spell scroll into your spellbook this way, so that's just something worth noting. For the Spellguard Shield, this one is unchanged. The Sphere of Annihilation has been changed pretty significantly. The damage it deals is now 8d10 force damage from 4d10, so it now deals twice as much damage. It is now a magic action to attempt to control the sphere from an action. Succeeding on the check gives you control of the sphere until the start of your next turn, whereas previously this only allowed you to move the sphere. Succeeding on the check automatically removes another creature's control of it, whereas previously you had to make an intelligence contest with that creature. It now moves towards you in a straight line if you fail that check, whereas previously it just said it moves towards you. But again, this thing doesn't care about things being in the way. It'll just go through them, so it can move in a straight line. It is now a bonus action to move the sphere when you get control of it, whereas previously there was no sort of action required. The save DC against this item is now at DC 19 from 13, so that is a significant buff, and a creature that is reduced to 0 is now completely obliterated. They leave all their equipment behind, but there's no physical remains of them that is left if they are dropped to 0 by this item. Moving on to the Spirit Board, this is new to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. This is effectively just a Ouija board that allows you to cast Augury or Commune with it. For the Staff of Adornment, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. The only change here is that the object you place above the staff must now be tiny. Previously, there were no restrictions on dimensions, only the weight. For the Staff of Bird Calls, this one was also added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is now a magic action to activate from an action, and the sound range is increased to 120 feet from 60 feet. For the Staff of Charming, it no longer states that it can be used as a quarterstaff. However, this is just a basic property of all staves. It also no longer states that it is an action to cast one of the spells from the staff, but again, that is implied by these spells requiring a magic action to cast in the first place. Additionally, the Reflect Enchantment feature no longer says that you can reflect the spell even if you succeed using the save of the Resist Enchantment feature, but this is still implied based on the description of the item. For the Staff of Fire, it no longer states it is an action to cast the spells from the staff, but again, it is implied because all of these spells require an action to cast. The Staff of Flowers was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from the Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is now a magic action to activate from an action. And then the last item for this video is the Staff of Healing. Much like the descriptions of the other staves, it no longer states that it requires an action to cast these spells. That would be implied by whatever the casting time of the spell is. So for Cure Wounds and Mass Cure Wounds, those are both actions, specifically the magic action to cast those spells. Lesser Restoration was buffed in 2024 to be a bonus action. It is also worth noting that there is sort of a secret buff to this item because all healing spells were buffed in 2024 as well. The Cure Wounds now heals twice the number of dice as it did in 2014 per spell level, and then Mass Cure Wounds now heals 5d8 plus your spell modifier, up from 3d8 plus your spell modifier in 2024. So not only can you cast Lesser Restoration as a bonus action now, but Cure Wounds and Mass Cure Wounds now just heal more, so you can get more out of the staff than you ever could. So it feels like we got through that one pretty fast compared to my other magic changes videos. Again, we only have one more of these videos left that'll come out next week. Then everything will be done. There was kind of an interesting trend, especially towards the early items in this video, where the changes were in what was removed from the description, not what was added or even altered in the description. So that was kind of cool to see. But let me know what you think is your favorite change or even just the most interesting change to the items in this video. If there's any sort of cool interactions that I missed or just didn't call out, you can let me know down in the comments as well. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more of my videos, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all of your time, and I'll see you in the next one.